Welcome to a Passamaquoddy podcast. This conversation is with retired police inspector Anil Anand. Anil, you came to this country when you were a little boy.
Yes.
And you now are at the outer ends of learning about Indigenous culture. Did that come directly through the police work?
No, in fact, very little of that learning occurred during my career as a police officer. I think a lot of the interest arose when I was assigned to the Ipperwash Inquiry a number of years ago.
Just give me a little précis on Ipperwash.
Ipperwash involved the Stony Point Park, which in 1942 was expropriated under the War Measures Act from the tribe that lived on that land. To practice landing at Normandy and on the European beaches. So those people that were living on that reservation were moved. The land was expropriated and never returned back. And so there was an ongoing land claims issue, which in 1998 burst into an occupation and a confrontation with the OPP, resulting in the death of Dudley George. That then resulted in a public inquiry under Dalton McGuinty. I was assigned to that as an investigator. And it was at that time that I think I kind of developed this interest in what was happening within the First Nations community, how police are injected within conflicts and expected to determine some sort of resolution when in fact they have no authority to do so, which in turn led me into the LLM program at Osgood, into restorative justice and ADR, which is where I met Alan Bonner. And that sort of was the genesis of my interest in First Nations issues.
I think your average Canadian, unfortunately, when you speak of the police and Indigenous people, you think of conflict right away.
Yes.
And how did you get past that?
I think that I've gotten past it because it's sort of been a personal interest of mine as a passion. I've always tended to have an interest in social justice issues, and this obviously is one of ours in Canada, and it's important for me. I had very little direct contact with First Nations people in terms of my policing career.
Which was largely Toronto.
Which was largely Toronto, yes. And Toronto is, not to say that we don't have First Nations people, there are approximately 70,000 First Nations people in Toronto that either live or transition through Toronto. We have a number of institutions or places of resources for First Nations people. What I did notice is that we are very careful in how we interact with those institutions. We assign specialized officers with special skills to liaise with those institutions because there's still a great deal of suspicion within First Nations people and the police.
Well, with the history, rightly so.
With the history, and I think it's simply because most Canadians, including people that I worked with in policing, especially metropolitan policing, don't understand the position of First Nations people within the Canadian constitutions and their rights and privileges. So that's an issue.
So what did you learn about the position within the Constitution and within Indigenous rights and privileges? At one point previously you said that police and the government had no right to walk into Ipperwash and just take the land away.
Well, I think that police tend to see conflicts as conflicts. We tend to see things as right and wrong. We tend to think of things primarily within the context of the criminal code. Now, I'm talking from the point of view of having been a Toronto police officer, which is a major metropolitan area. The OPP has more contact with First Nations people, and they deal with First Nations policing as well, so they have a different level of understanding as may the RCMP. But my experience as a major city police officer in the major city, and Toronto is the 6th largest city in North America, was that police officers that I worked with could use much more training in terms of understanding Section 35, the special position of First Nations people within that, accommodations under the criminal code, for example, the Gladue case, which allows for special consideration for sentencing of First Nations people. I think the issues that cause First Nations people to behave differently when it comes to their views on land claims. We, for instance, read statements acknowledging that we are sitting on First Nations territories, whether we're having public or private programs. Those are things that are token, they're symbolic, but they're important. And so we send one message to First Nations people, but many of us don't understand the impact of the roots of those and the significance of those statements.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of even parties, groupings, conferences, when there is a First Nations person there who stands up and says, we are on the land of. And it's a real eye-opener.
It's an eye-opener.
The first time that happens to you, you think, right.
Yes, it is an eye-opener. And I think it's an eye-opener for those of us that have been long-term Canadians. I think it's even more of an eye-opener for more recent Canadians. I mean, 20% of Canadians, 1 in 5 Canadians, is a recent immigrant to Canada. And immigrants that have come to Canada more recently are fleeing conflicts in the parts of the world that they've fled from, whether it's religious, politics, economic, or other issues. So when they arrive here, they are working very hard to try and address the issues of those people that they've left behind. They have their own concerns in trying to fit into this new, very multicultural, diverse society and establish their own positions, let alone understand the diversity and the importance of First Nations people. And they, I think, are very often left a very retracted perspective on what First Nations people are.
And how far are we now with integrating the two cultures? If Canada has only 2 cultures, I mean, we have many, but folding in the Indigenous cultural ceremonies, feelings, justice into your everyday Canadian life?
I think that that's a good question, and I think this is what prompted me to sort of take an interest in this issue more recently. After the release of the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, after the release of the report on the residential schools, it occurs to me that I don't think most people understand the genesis of those issues. And since
it's horrific.
It's horrific. And so we're more focused on the use of the term genocide, for example, or the use of the term cultural genocide in the residential school report, in the residential school report, than we were on what do we do to move forward. So we will continue to deal with land claims issues, so the types that we've had in Oka, which is resurging now. The Kinder Morgan pipeline is going to result in a number of issues. We've had Caledonia, we've had Ipperwash, we've had a number of other ones. So these are ongoing issues. And they're legitimate issues for First Nations people because their claims have been reaffirmed and recognized in the Constitution. These are their claims, and we need to address them. And the government's going to apologize, as we have for certain residential schools. But if people don't have contact with First Nations people, I don't think they understand the importance of the relevance of this to our society.
And what about the value of celebration, cultural celebration? Is that important?
I think cultural celebration is very important. 90% of recent immigrants are going to live either in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, or Calgary. Those are the 3 out of the 33 CMAs. They will never truly understand how diverse our First Nations people are. Our First Nations people live from coast to coast. There are over 366 bands. They live on over 2,000 different reservations. They have 11 families of languages and speak over 53 different languages across the country. They are very diverse in themselves. But without celebrating those differences and that culture in its fullest way, we will all be left with this redacted view of what First Nations people are. And a lot of that is very stereotypically negative. And because immigrants live in the CMAs, major metropolitan areas, 90% of them, well, our First Nations people don't live in the CMAs. They don't exercise their culture here. They live outside. So unlike learning about others' cultures, whether you're from Ukraine or India or South Asia or wherever it might be, that's far easier because we're put together. But we are very removed from our First Nations people. That I think requires a special effort.
A long time study.
A long time study, yes.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to a Passamaquoddy podcast. Join in the conversation. You can call the main office at area code 506-466-2216. The website is www.kenosamcook.com. That's QONASKAMCOOK.com. kuk.com. Our Facebook address is at Passamaquoddy at Skutik Office, Instagram at Passamaquoddy Office, and the Twitter at Skukitat, Skutikat.